Russia. The Ural Mountains. The border between Europe and Asia. In this region, rivers have unusual names. The Kama River. Kama, in Sanskrit, is the god of love. The Siva River. Siva, in Old Sanskrit, is Shiva, one of the most important deities in Hinduism. The Moksha River. Moksha, in Sanskrit, means liberation from rebirth. And then, the Arya River. Multiple rivers across the steppe carry this name. Arya, in Sanskrit, means noble. These names have puzzled researchers for a century. Words preserved in the ancient, sacred language of India, sitting on the Russian steppe. Linguists argue they are traces of a very old Indo-Iranian language once spoken in this region. If so, the rivers carry names older than the people living beside them today. How old? That is where the story gets strange. In 1903, an Indian scholar named Bal Gangadhar Tilak published a book. He had spent years reading the Rigveda, the oldest Sanskrit text. He noticed something odd. He believed certain passages described an ancient homeland, a place with very long days, very long nights, darkness lasting for months, a sun that circles the horizon without setting. None of this describes India. It describes somewhere much further north. His book, The Arctic Home in the Vedas, argued the ancestors of the Vedic people originally came from the far north. He was pointing in the right direction. The specific location, wrong. The evidence to go further, not yet there. Decades later, a Soviet ethnographer named Svetlana Zharnikova picked up the same thread. She spent years going through geographical records, river names, lake names, village names, across northern Russia and the Urals, systematically, name by name. What she found, hundreds of place names with apparent Sanskrit roots. Not just the Kama and the Siva, rivers called Indra, lakes called Rama. She argued these were traces of an ancient Indo-Iranian population that had lived here before migrating south. Mainstream archaeology dismissed her. Too speculative, too far beyond the evidence, and uncomfortably close to the kind of nationalist mythology that serious scholarship works hard to avoid. She kept working. In 1987, something happened in a river valley in the southern Ural steppe that she had been looking for without knowing it. Soviet engineers were preparing to flood a valley for a reservoir. A dam was already under construction. An aerial survey revealed something unexpected. 2 concentric rings in the earth, large, precise. Archaeologists moved in to excavate before the water came. What they found stopped the dam. A Bronze Age city, around 4,000 years old, built to a precise geometric plan. The outer wall, roughly 160 meters in diameter, timber and packed earth, coated with thick clay. Inside, circular streets paved with wooden logs, drainage channels running beneath them. Every home connected to the drainage system, every home with its own water well. And right next to the well, every house had a metallurgy furnace. Not some houses, every house. The air was drawn from the well into the furnace through an underground channel, using basic thermodynamics. No bellows, no mechanical device. Temperatures reaching 1,200 to 1,500 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to cast bronze in the middle of the steppe. Archaeologists rebuilt the furnace as an experiment. It worked. The city was named Arkaim. The dam was almost finished. News of the discovery appeared in Soviet newspapers in autumn 1987, the era of perestroika and glasnost. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could speak publicly. They spoke. Letters flooded into the Central Committee from scientists, teachers, factory workers, students from across the USSR. The director of the Hermitage, Boris Piotrovsky, came out publicly in defense of the site. In the Soviet Union, state infrastructure projects did not get stopped by letter campaigns. This one did. By March 1988, construction was suspended. The dam body was already built, one section away from flooding. That section was never blocked. In April 1991, the site was declared a protected reserve. The letters worked, because the graves inside that valley would eventually change what we knew about the ancient world. Arkaim was not alone. Within a radius of 400 kilometers, archaeologists have found more than 20 similar settlements, built to the same circular plan, the same period, the same culture. Researchers call it the Land of Cities, a Bronze Age civilization covering a vast stretch of the southern Ural Steppe that nobody knew existed until the 1980s. Most were found not by digging, but by looking at aerial photographs. Rings in the earth, visible from above. Some are still being identified today. Thousands of artifacts, a picture of daily life that surprised archaeologists. The people of Arkaim were tall, strongly built, light-skinned, light-eyed. The burials reveal a strongly stratified society. Warriors, metallurgical specialists, herders and farmers. Some researchers have noted parallels with the social divisions described centuries later in Vedic tradition. Whether that reflects a direct connection remains debated. Each house held an extended family of 20 to 30 people. Diet: beef, mutton, milk, cheese, porridge, riverfish. Women's skeletons show severe wear on knees and spine from a lifetime of grinding grain on stone slabs. Men's upper bodies heavily developed from horses and metalwork. In children's graves, tiny clay pots the size of thimbles, miniature bone harness fittings, toys. Every child buried with full ritual and food for the journey, a full member of the clan from birth. The fire in every furnace was sacred. Before the first copper went in, food and animal bones were thrown into the flame. The descendants of these people would later call the fire god Agni. At Arkaim, the archaeology shows the same ritual. Sacred fire as the channel between humans and gods. The Rigveda describes homes with sacred fire altars, a city built around smoke and bronze. Some researchers have noted the parallels are striking. Whether they reflect direct continuity remains debated. At the center of the city, a square for ceremonies. Horses sacrificed at the solstice, at the death of a warrior, at the new year. The city itself was an observatory. 18 confirmed astronomical alignments. A priest at a specific point on the inner wall, looking through a specific opening in the outer wall, toward a specific hill on the horizon, could fix the exact moment of the summer solstice to within minutes. No instruments, no lenses. The city was the instrument. In the burial mounds, archaeologists found horses and wheels, not heavy solid wooden wheels, spoked wheels, light, fast, built for war. Before the Syntashta evidence, the earliest chariots were believed to have originated in Mesopotamia or the Near East. The Syntashta burial sites are older, the oldest dated to 2026 BCE. These are the earliest known spoked wheel war chariots in the archaeological record. The bone harness fittings, called salia, had sharp spikes on the inner side. One-handed control at full gallop. Two warriors, one driving, one fighting, crashing into infantry at full speed. Researchers built a working reconstruction and drove it across the steppe. It worked, but a chariot is useless if the horse pulling it bolts at the first sound of battle. For decades, scientists debated where modern domestic horses came from. The leading theory pointed to the Botai culture of Kazakhstan, who kept horses around 5,500 years ago. Then DNA analysis overturned it. The Botai horses were ancestors of Przewalski's wild horse, not modern domestic ones. In 2021, geneticists analysed hundreds of ancient horse genomes. Almost all modern domestic horses descend from a single genetic line that emerged among the Sintashta people. They selected for specific traits: ZFPM1, reduced stress responses; calmer under pressure; GSDMC, a stronger spine to carry weight. Within a few centuries, this lineage replaced most wild horse populations from Portugal to China. Every horse that has ever been ridden traces back here. Arkaim existed for about 150 to 200 years. Then the people left. One theory: they had cut down all the forests for smelting fuel. Their cattle had destroyed the pastures. The land was exhausted, but they did not simply leave. Before they walked out, they packed everything. Then they burned the city. Coal layer analysis showed the entire city ignited simultaneously, from multiple points at once. Not a fire spreading from one house. All of it at the same moment. Clay-covered timber does not catch fire easily. To burn the way it burned, the residents had to stack dry brushwood, straw and birch bark against the walls from the inside. No human remains were found inside the walls. Everyone was already outside when the first fire was lit. The Sintashta were fire worshippers. Burning the city before leaving may have been a ritual act, returning it to the sacred element. They migrated south, across Central Asia, into Iran, into northern India. They brought their chariots, their fire rituals, their language, and they left behind a ghost town, hidden in the grass. Geneticists extracted DNA from the Sintashta skeletons. They found a specific genetic marker, haplogroup R1A-Z93. This lineage is today most strongly represented among the upper castes of northern India, including Brahmin priests, and among populations in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Iran. A lineage traceable through steppe populations into South and Central Asia. 4,000 years of movement, visible in living people today. Traditions carried by these migrants contributed to the culture that later produced the Rigveda. Their fire rituals contributed to what became Zoroastrianism. Some researchers have noted striking parallels between Arkaim's layout and descriptions of sacred settlements in the Rigveda and the Avesta. Whether that reflects direct continuity is still debated. The Sintashta answer is solid. The genetics, the archaeology, the linguistics, they agree. But the DNA also shows that the Sintashta themselves came from somewhere. Their genome is nearly identical to the corded ware culture of Central and Eastern Europe. Before that, the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Before that, the haplogroup R1A, formed somewhere in southern Siberia approximately 20,000 years ago. Arkaim is not the beginning. It is a moment in a longer story whose start we have not yet found. The Sintashta people left Russia thousands of years ago. Their fortresses decayed, their descendants changed. Modern populations moved in, speaking a different tongue. But the names of the waters stayed: the Kama, the Siva, the Moksha. New populations kept using the old names because they didn't know what else to call them. Some linguists now argue these names make sense in a way they didn't before Arkaim. Rivers keep their names longer than almost anything else. Names still on the map, a city still in the steppe, fragments of a world that was larger than we knew and older than we thought. Through archaeology, language, and memory, pieces of it keep surfacing. In archaeology, there is a word for a culture that spreads so fast and so wide that it seems to appear everywhere at once. They call it a horizon, not a single kingdom, not an empire with a capital city, a shared way of living, a shared way of making tools, a shared way of burying the dead. South of the Urals, the Andronovo Horizon. The name comes from a small village near Achinsk in southern Siberia. In 1914, workers laying a railway line cut straight through a burial mound. An archaeologist named Sergei Teplukov, sorting through the salvage finds 13 years later, named what he'd found after the nearest village on the map. Nobody had heard of Andronovo. Almost nobody has since. The culture is another matter. Not small. Millions of square kilometers. From the Ural Mountains east to the borders of China. From the Siberian forests south to the deserts of Uzbekistan. 1800 to 900 BCE. If you flew across it 4,000 years ago, you would see the same timber-framed houses overlooking rivers, the same pottery with geometric zigzags, the same spoked wheel tracks in the dirt. For decades, historians looked at this massive space on the map and assumed it was a vacuum, a wasteland of nomadic herders going nowhere. The archaeology tells a different story. It was the industrial powerhouse of the Bronze Age world, and it was moving. The people of Arkaim burned their cities and walked away, but they did not disappear. They expanded. The Andronovo is not a different people. It is the same people, wider. The Sintashta culture of Arkaim dissolved outward into a horizon that stretched across a continent. They took the engineered horse. They took the spoked war chariot. And they took something else, an obsession with metal. In the Altai Mountains, thousands of miles east of the Urals, archaeologists found their mines. Deep shafts cut into solid rock, using stone hammers and fire setting, heating the rock face, then throwing cold water on it to crack it apart. Not surface scratching, extracting thousands of tons of copper and tin. One branch went east, along the Altai Mountains and the edge of the Tarim Desert, toward China. In the 13th century BCE, a spoked wheel chariot appears at the Shang court at Anyang, fully formed, with no local developmental sequence, no prototype. It arrived complete. Another branch went south, toward the oases, toward India. They built their settlements along the banks of calm steppe rivers, where the wide floodplain meadows gave them pasture, where the fertile soil gave good harvests. Semi-subterranean houses, dug into the earth for warmth, 2 or 3 rooms connected by internal passages, each room heated by a hearth built from flat stone slabs. The roof, a wooden frame rising on thin logs and stone supports, covered in reed matting. At every entrance, a separate draft room, a small airlock against the steppe wind, built to protect the sleeping quarters from the cold. In the excavated hearths, bone needles, bronze knives, a bone tool for scraping hides. In the fields, millet, rye, wheat. Outside, cattle, horses, sheep, and no pigs. Not one across any Andronovo site anywhere, because pigs cannot follow a moving camp. A pig tells you that you plan to stay. Not wanderers, not settlers, something in between. We know what they looked like. Burials found in Xinjiang, preserved in the dry desert air, show people who looked European. They wore long shirts below the knee, trousers, knitted woolen socks. Men and women dressed the same way. You could only tell them apart by their ornaments and by who had weapons. Their pottery was made by hand. 2 shapes, a straight-walled jar and a curved or angled pot, decorated with geometric stamps pressed into the wet clay. Zigzags, triangles. To understand what the Andronovo valued, look at how they buried their dead. Under earth mounds called kurgans, each one enclosed by a ring of standing or flat-laid stone slabs, a circle of stone around the dead, a boundary between the living world and the other one. Inside the mound, a timber chamber, buried deep. Always the same orientation. Body on the left side, facing west, towards the setting sun. In one burial, an infant, on its left side, facing west. At its head, a small ceramic vessel, placed there with food for the journey, because the Andronovo believed the dead needed to eat. In another burial, a man and a woman, lying on their sides, facing each other, their fingers intertwined. The pose was deliberate, arranged. It meant something. And beside the dead, almost always, the bones of the horse. Not the whole animal, the head and the lower legs, the parts left after a sacrificial feast. The ritual matches the Rigveda, the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice. The animal slaughtered, its flesh consumed by the tribe, its sacred parts buried with the dead. The texts were written down in India centuries later. The bones are in the Siberian earth today. Not every Andronovo burial is an inhumation. In some, only ash. Emma Usmanova, who has directed excavations at Lysakovsk in Kazakhstan for 30 years, describes the logic. The fire does not destroy. It transports, and it connects without a break in the chain to the cremation pyres of the Ganges 2,000 years later. The headwear tells the rest. Usmanova's excavations produced headdresses in multiple distinct styles across different ages. Girls wore one type, young women another, older women a third. One reconstructed headdress, 12 meters of braided cord, 70 hours of work, made at night because in daylight too many errors crept in. 18th century BCE, Hammurabi's Babylon rising in Mesopotamia, the Hittites in Asia Minor, Egypt in the Middle Kingdom, building temples expanding borders. In Syria, the kingdom of Mitanni. These were the great powers, the civilizations with armies and archives and stone monuments that would last 3,000 years. And all of them needed bronze. Copper alone is soft, useless for weapons. Tin hardens it. But tin is rare. A specific geology, specific deposits. The Andronovo people found them. And the great Bronze Age empires needed what was under the Andronovo's feet. In 1982, a ship was found off the coast of southern Turkey, the Uluburun wreck, dated to around 1320 BCE. Inside its hull, 10 metric tons of copper ingots, 1 metric ton of tin, enough to equip 5,000 soldiers with bronze swords. A 2022 analysis in Science Advances traced 1/3 of that tin to mines in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, more than 3,000 kilometers from where the ship went down, handed from trader to trader, across rivers and deserts, from the steppe to the palaces of pharaohs. The herders of the north were not isolated. They held something the ancient world needed. But metal was not the only thing moving. The people themselves were going south. But around 2000 BCE, as their clans pushed further south, the open steppe suddenly vanished. And in the desert river basins of Central Asia, they ran headfirst into a completely different human experiment. An empire of mud, protected by massive walls. In Soviet school textbooks, the Karakum Desert was described as one of the world's great uninhabited wastelands, where occasionally a shepherd might pass with his flock. Otherwise, nothing. The shepherds knew otherwise. They had noticed the mounds. In 1972, a Soviet archaeologist named Viktor Saryanidy followed one of those shepherds to the largest mound he knew. In Turkmen, it had a name. Gonur Depi, Grey Hill. He picked up the first pottery fragments from the surface. National Geographic called him the non-stop archaeologist. He came back every year for 40 years. What he found under that grey hill would change the picture entirely. This was the world of the Oxus Civilization, flourishing in modern Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan from 2300 to 1700 BCE. These were not nomads. They were indigenous oasis farmers who grew wheat, traded with Mesopotamia, and built massive mud brick fortresses with high walls and watchtowers. The Andronovo nomads were about to encounter something they had no words for, but they didn't have to breach the walls to get inside. Excavating major Oxus sites like Gonur Depi, archaeologists noticed something strange in the later layers. Mixed in among the sophisticated, wheel-turned city pottery, they found crude, handmade fragments. It is called incised coarse ware, the unmistakable geometric fingerprint of the northern steppe nomads. Outside the walls, investigators found temporary Andronovo-type camps like Gonur 14. But soon, the steppe pottery began appearing inside the strongholds, sitting in the exact same archaeological layers as the city pottery. Harvard archaeologist Frederick Hebert proposed that these weren't raids. These camps were spaces where the two communities met to feast and negotiate. The nomads had something the city elites desperately needed: metals. The Oxus cities lacked mineral wealth. The steppe nomads controlled the vast copper and tin mines of the northern mountains. An economic partnership was born. The nomads brought raw tin and copper. The city gave them grain, textiles, and pottery. Some nomads never left. Along the Amu Darya River, we find Andronovo skeletons buried near newly built irrigation canals. Pastoralists who settled down and learned the technology of the oasis. To understand the spiritual infection the steppe people caught here, you have to look at what was happening behind those walls. Step inside, and it was a sensory explosion. The ring of metalworkers pouring silver, the clatter of stone carvers, and the rhythmic thud of over 100 pottery kilns. Vivid narrative mosaics covered the walls, depicting griffins and mythical beasts in combat. And the people themselves looked otherworldly to a nomad. High-status women swept through the streets in tiered dresses that pooled at the ground, their hair woven into elaborate headdresses. The ruling class bore striking, sharp profiles, small faces with strongly projecting eagle noses and massive, prominent eyes. But it was their obsession with beauty that stood out. In almost every tomb, archaeologists found bronze mirrors, eye applicators, and cosmetic palettes with elegant serpentine handles. This wasn't vanity. As French archaeologist Gabriel Rossi Osmida noted, it was a ritual presentation of oneself before the divine and before death itself. Yet, nobody actually lived inside the central complex. It was a massive, highly organized sacred precinct reserved only for the priests. Every entrance was blocked by advanced water purification basins. And at the heart of this sacred city was an absolute obsession with fire. The economic foundation of the Oxus Civilization was metallurgy, and metallurgy is fire. The same element burning on their temple altars was the element that transformed crushed ore into gleaming bronze wealth. Fire did not just connect them to the divine, it created wealth from stone. Because of this, the line between industry and spirituality completely blurred. Sarianidi discovered special two-chamber ovens constructed so that the pure element of fire would never directly touch raw, sacrificial meat. This isn't just a ritual food rule, it is metallurgical logic applied to a kitchen. To cast pure metal without contamination from ash or fuel, you must isolate the fire and channel the heat with precision. The fire was sacred, and it could not be contaminated. The Andronovo nomads who controlled the northern mines were the ones bringing the raw stone to these master firesmiths. Fire became the ultimate bridge between the two peoples. The nomads brought the stone, the Oxus Civilization turned it into the world. And the nomads were watching. As generations of trade passed, the intense interaction permanently altered the spiritual world of the steppe. In the later sacred texts of India and Iran, the Rigveda and the Avesta, two massive cultural pillars dominate: the construction of complex geometric fire altars and the worship of a sacred, mind-altering ritual drink called Soma. For decades, scholars assumed these practices came from the northern grasslands, but the archaeology of the northern steppe shows no evidence of them. Instead, inside the Oxus shrines of Togolok 21, Sarianidi found monumental ritual complexes centered around fire worship, containing specialized vessels with traces of ephedra, poppy, and cannabis. Open the Rigveda. The entire 9th book is devoted to Soma, describing the plant stalks pressed between stones and filtered through sheep's wool. It is the exact same substance and the exact same preparation process, found preserved in the gypsum layers of the Oxus shrines. Linguists Alexander Lubotsky and Michael Witzel argue that the incoming Indo-Iranians didn't bring Soma from the north. They discovered it here, in the dark shrines of the desert oases. They adopted the local priesthood's fire altars and purification rituals, fused them with their own nomadic sky gods, and made them the core of their identity. Even the language of the steppe was transformed. Linguists have identified a massive block of shared words in both Sanskrit and Avestan that have absolutely no Indo-European roots. The steppe herders learned the Oxus word for brick, istika, the word for ploughshare, phala, and the word for camel, ustra. Most importantly, they absorbed the Oxus root word for priest, atharvan. They arrived with wagons and cattle. They left with a priesthood. To see how fast this new hybrid culture began to move, we have to look west. In 1380 BCE, a diplomatic treaty was struck in northern Syria between the Hittites and the kingdom of Mitanni. The Mitanni rulers spoke a local language, but they carried Indo-Aryan names and swore oaths to Vedic gods inscribed in the clay: Mitra, Varuna, Indra, and the Nasatyas. From the same archives, a horse training manual by a Mitanni master named Kikuli uses Sanskrit-like counting words to track laps: Aika, Tera, Panza, Sata, Nava. One branch of this mobile culture had driven all the way to the Mediterranean, leaving a timestamp in Syrian clay. But the main branch turned south. Around 1700 BCE, the climate dried out completely. The Murghab River shifted course, the irrigation networks failed, and the grand mud brick oases of the Oxus Civilization were permanently abandoned. But the culture didn't die. By the time of the collapse, the crude handmade pottery of the steppe camps had vanished from the record, replaced entirely by wheel-turned, Oxus-style ceramics. The nomads had fully absorbed the city's craft and identity. And modern genetics reveals a stunning plot twist. A landmark 2019 study by Vagish Narasimhan confirmed that the Oxus city dwellers themselves did not migrate to India. Their genetic line essentially dead ends in Central Asia. Instead, it was the steppe nomads who became the vessels. They were the ones who lived in the camps, learned the words, adopted the fire rituals, and mastered the Soma preparation. And when the oases collapsed, it was the steppe people who carried this transformed, hybrid culture out of the desert. The Oxus civilization's contribution to the future of South Asia was profound, but it traveled in the bloodlines of the nomads. They arrived at the oasis carrying one civilization's genetics and left carrying another civilization's soul. Wielding the mobile military technology of the northern chariot, but armed with the sacred architecture of the southern city, this newly transformed population began to fracture. The Andronovo Horizon had never been a single unified people. It was divided into distinct regional subcultures: the Western Alakul, the Eastern Fedorovo. Some scholars, notably Elena Kuzmina, have linked the Fedorovo specifically to the Indo-Aryan migrations southward. If that's right, the groups heading toward the Hindu Kush were already culturally distinct from those who would eventually become the Iranians. The split had already begun in the camps. One branch turned west, toward the Iranian plateau. The other turned southeast, toward the Hindu Kush. And as they separated, the shared mother tongue split with them. You can hear it in a single word. The sacred drink they had both borrowed from the oasis shrines. The Indo-Aryan branch called it Soma. The Iranian branch called it Haoma. Same plant, same ritual, same root. One sound shifted, two languages diverging, and after the split deepened, something stranger happened. The Iranian branch, under Zoroaster, reformed its religion, and in that reform, Indra, the greatest warrior god of the Rigveda, the figure who receives a quarter of all its hymns, was named a demon. The gods of one tradition became the demons of the other. Scholars debate exactly why. The leading theory: Zoroaster was rejecting the violent cattle-raiding warrior culture that Indra represented. precisely what the Rigveda celebrates. Two traditions, the same origin, moving apart. The gateway to the subcontinent was finally open. We are getting closer. Between the oasis cities of Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent lies a mountain system of extraordinary scale. The Hindu Kush, the Karakoram, the Western Himalayas. For most of human history, these mountains looked like a wall. But there is a gap. Geographers call it the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor, a chain of river valleys and alpine pastures running from what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, southeast through Afghanistan, and into Pakistan's northwest frontier. Not a road, not a pass, a corridor, wide enough for herds, rich enough in summer pasture to sustain cattle and horses, connected by the same river system that feeds from snowmelt off the Hindu Kush. The corridor was not empty. People had been living along it for thousands of years. Farming communities in the valley floors, pastoral groups moving between summer and winter pastures on the slopes. What the Bronze Age steppe people brought was something new. The horse, the bronze weapon, the spoked wheel chariot, and a specific way of organizing society around a priestly and warrior elite. The corridor was their highway south, and at the northern end of that highway, a city. In the Zeravshan Valley of what is now Tajikistan, midway between the Oxus Oases and the Hindu Kush, there is a site called Sarazm. Its name means where the land begins. It sits at the exact junction of two worlds. Behind it, the mountains, suited for pastoral herding. Below it, a wide, fertile valley, watered by the Zeravshan River, ideal for irrigated agriculture. Sarazm was found in 1976, not by an archaeologist, by a local man who turned up a small bronze axe while digging. Formal excavations began the following year. They are still ongoing. The site was occupied from around 3,500 to 2000 BCE. At its height, it had about 3,000 residents, dwellings, workshops, a communal granary, a palace, irrigation systems feeding the fields below, and something that stopped the excavators: round altars. The excavators interpreted them as evidence of an early fire cult, possibly the oldest pre-Zoroastrian fire worship site yet found, according to some researchers. Whether or not that connection holds, the altars are real. The fire was clearly sacred here. The fire ritual, which would later appear in both the Rigveda and the Avesta, may have had roots in this mountain corridor. That is a leading hypothesis, not a settled conclusion. In one burial dated to approximately 3000 BCE, a woman. Her grave goods were extraordinary. Beads of lapis lazuli, jet, and turquoise. A bronze mirror. The lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan's Badakhshan region, confirmed by isotope analysis. UNESCO confirmed. Sarazm was trading with the Iranian plateau, the Indus Valley, the steppe of Central Asia, and as far as the Indian Ocean. All of this, 3,000 years before the Common Era. And in the mountains above the Zeravshan Valley, significant tin and copper deposits have been documented, associated with Bronze Age metalworking. Whether the Andronovo specifically controlled these resources or simply traded through the area is debated. What is clear is that metal and people moved through this corridor for centuries. What Sarazm tells us is that this corridor was not empty wilderness when people began moving south. It was a known junction, a waypoint on a route that had been travelled for 1,000 years already. The corridor had a history before the steppe people used it, and now they were walking it too, following the same rivers, the same passes that traders and shepherds had used for 1,000 years before them. They walked these valleys slowly, stopping, settling for a generation, mixing with the farming communities already there, then moving on again. Not an invasion, a drift, according to the genetic evidence. And during those years, something else was happening. The culture was continuing to absorb and transform. Moving through Afghanistan, they encountered farming communities with their own agricultural vocabulary and their own ritual traditions. More words were borrowed, more practices adopted. The language they carried south was not the language that had left the steppe. It had been shaped by contact with the Oxus Civilization. It was being shaped further with every new valley they entered. To the people who would later write the Rigveda, this valley had a name, Suvastu, a good dwelling place. The Swat Valley sits in what is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in the northwest of modern Pakistan. Not what you might imagine for a Bronze Age arrival point, not a flat plain or a desert crossing. A stunning alpine corridor, rushing snow-fed rivers cutting through deep green valleys, dense pine forests on the slopes, steep jagged cliffs rising to mountain passes above. The people already living here were settled farmers, stone and timber villages tucked into the mountain terraces. Wheat and barley in the riverside fields, peas and lentils in the garden plots, humpbacked zebu cattle grazing the valley floors, sheep and goats on the slopes above, a prosperous, settled world. Then, around 1400 BCE, at the beginning of what archaeologists call the Gandhara grave culture, something new appeared in the archaeological record of the Swat Valley, a sound the valley had never heard before. Horses. Horse bones appear in Swat Valley burial sites associated with this period. Domesticated horses are largely absent from earlier South Asian contexts. This is one of the archaeological markers scholars point to as evidence of incoming populations with steppe connections. Archaeologists call what emerged the Gandhara grave culture, or the Swat proto-historic grave type. The specific excavation sites, Galigay, Udagram, show what the fusion looked like in practice. Local, wheel-turned dark ceramics alongside steppe-influenced forms. Bronze pins for fastening wool garments, horse bones in certain burials. And then, in the later phases of the culture, a significant shift. Cremation became more common. The ashes placed inside ceramic jars, in some cases molded with stylized human faces, pressed into the clay before firing. The Rigveda is the oldest surviving text in any Indo-European language, or among the oldest, depending on which dating scholars use. It was not written down when composed, it was memorized, passed from teacher to student, word for word, syllable by syllable, for centuries before anyone committed it to writing. And inside the text, in Book 10, Hymn 75, called the Nadistuti Sukta, the hymn in praise of rivers, there is a geographical clue that scholars have spent 2 centuries trying to interpret. The hymn lists rivers: Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Sutudri, Parusni, Askini, Vitasta. Then, the Kuba, the Kabul River in Afghanistan, the Krumu, the Kuram in Pakistan's tribal areas. How did scholars identify these rivers? By tracing the names across centuries of language change. Kuba in the Rigveda became Kofun in Greek sources written during Alexander's campaigns. 3 texts from different authors all use that name for the Kabul River. The Krumu, the Kuram, is established by phonological similarity and geographic continuity with historical maps. Not all identifications are equally certain. Some rivers in the hymn remain debated. Now read the full list again. The hymn moves from east to west, starting at the Ganges and working back through the rivers of Pakistan and into Afghanistan. One leading interpretation: the composers knew all of these rivers personally. They were in the northwest, in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, looking east toward a land they were still approaching. This would place the composition of the world's oldest surviving Indo-European religious text in exactly the same geography as the genetic signal, the words and the DNA pointing to the same place. That interpretation is not universally accepted. Some scholars argue the hymn is a later compilation of geographic knowledge rather than a record of presence. But the geography is real. The rivers are real. And the fact that the composers named rivers all the way from the Ganges to the Kabul River suggests they knew this whole landscape, whether from presence or from living memory of people who had been there. Either way, the Northwest Corridor was not an abstract route for the composers of the Rigveda. It was home, or the memory of home. As these clans pushed out of the Swat Mountains and onto the vast fertile plains of the Punjab, they encountered the remnants of the Indus world. The great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had collapsed centuries before, but the people had not disappeared. They had dispersed, continued, built smaller communities in the river valleys. At Harappa itself, archaeologists found a distinct layer directly above the old city ruins. They called it the Cemetery H culture. It is a true melting pot. The pottery is wheel-turned and sophisticated, a direct legacy of the Indus artisans. What was new was what these pots were for. Increasingly, they were made to hold ashes. For the first time in this region, cremation. One of the signatures increasingly associated with steppe-descended populations of this period. The incoming people brought the horse, the chariot, and the language of the sky. The local population provided the agricultural routes, the ancient bloodlines, and the pottery wheels. Two worlds fusing into one. The most comprehensive ancient DNA study of South and Central Asia was published in 2019 by Narasimhan, Patterson, Reich, and colleagues in the journal Science. 523 ancient individuals, 11,000 years of South and Central Asian prehistory. The key findings for this story: the Indus Valley Civilization peak, multiple individuals from Harappan sites dated before 1900 BCE. Zero-step ancestry, not a trace. One study gets cited constantly as evidence against migration, when it is actually evidence for the timeline. The Rakhigarhi study, led by Indian archaeologist Professor Vasant Shinde, published in Cell in 2019, tested an IVC individual dated to 2800 to 2300 BCE. Zero-step ancestry. This is not a contradiction. This is exactly what the migration model predicts. Steppe ancestry had not yet arrived in South Asia at that date. It appears later, in the Swat Valley from around 1200 BCE. The Rakhigarhi result is not evidence against migration. It is the baseline that makes the later signal meaningful. The Swat Valley, 1200 to 800 BCE. Steppe ancestry present and increasing. Steppe ancestry arrived first through women. The male R1A signal built up later, over generations. This is the genetic marker that, according to the current mainstream consensus, links the Bronze Age steppe to modern South Asian populations. The steppe people did not replace the people of South Asia. They mixed with them, gradually, over centuries. Not replacement, layering, not invasion, absorption. By now, they were far from where they started. Along the way, they had absorbed the words, the gods, and the rituals of every valley they passed through. By the time they reached the Indus, they were no longer simple herders from the northern steppe. They had been remade, and the tool that remade them was fire. Fire had lived in every home in that circular city of Arkaim on the Ural steppe, and it was fire that consumed the whole citadel when they finally burned it to the ground and walked away. It was fire in the pit furnaces of Central Asia, turning raw ore into bronze. It was fire in the shrines of the Oxus world, and on the altars already burning at Sarazm in this very corridor. Fire shaped their metal. It marked their dead. It carried their prayers to the sky. No one recorded where the first verse of the Rigveda was composed. There was no writing yet to record it. We don't know the exact spot. We may never know. But the genetics, the linguistics, and the earth itself all lean toward this same corridor between the steppe and the subcontinent, more than anywhere further east. Agnim Isla. I praise the fire, the very first words of the world's oldest surviving Indo-European religious text. Of course it was fire. It had walked beside them the entire way.